Thank you. Thanks very much, Sam. And thank you to everyone for having me today. I'm really delighted and honoured to be part of the conversation and to help kick things off. So I've been, as Sam said, very much involved in shaping the UK government's position on the post-2015 development agenda over the last 12 months, and in particular very, very heavily involved in the day-to-day working of the Open Working Group, which I think helps inform this conversation in several ways, really. The main way being that the Open Working Group on the Sustainable Development Goals mandated at Rio was the first, or one of the first, testing grounds for how climate change would land in the development agenda internationally. Really the first testing ground where a large number of countries came together to try to thrash it out, as it were, in the first conversation about the Sustainable Development Goals. And I found, personally, one of the most interesting narratives, one of the most interesting stories to unfold across the Open Working Group, in all its 17 or 20 or 21 goals, or however many we started with, was the narrative around climate change. There are lessons there, I think, around the process. So what actually happened and why did it happen in the Open Working Group that are interesting. And there are lessons there about the results. So where did it leave us and where do we go from here? So firstly, on the process, I mean, I don't know how many of you, I know that a number of colleagues were heavily involved in the Open Working Group. I see them around the room. The initial 8 to 9 months of the Open Working Group were essentially stock taking. So basically around thematic issues, from everything from poverty to climate to health and education to cities and back again, whereby members of the Open Working Group took stock of what the critical issues were for the post-2015 agenda and began to hint at their government's positions. And for me, as I say, climate change began to unfold as one of the most interesting narratives across that whole process. What the co-chairs decided to do, I thought, well, as routinely initially, was hold a session on climate change and invite a really, really good panel to come and speak. And on that panel was a number of people, including Andrew Steer, who's president of the World Resource Institute. And he made a particularly strong statement about climate change and the importance in post-2015. And it's perhaps the only sentence, having sat there for hours and hours and hours, that I still remember very, very vividly. He said, so you guys sitting in the room here, you're the best we've got, speaking to the negotiators, you're the best we've got. We need you to help us interpret climate change in this agenda. And I challenge you to point out one SDG that isn't fundamentally impacted at some point by climate change. And it really landed in the room. You could really sort of sense that people listened and engaged in it both intuitively and emotionally. And it really set the tone of the conversation, I thought, which then happened, whereby it was very, very hard in the room to point to any delegate who disagreed. You know, there was no indication that somehow that anyone in the room thought that somehow climate change didn't matter to poverty eradication. Fundamentally, it matters to poverty eradication, that it matters to health and education outcomes, that it matters to all outcomes, not only environmental sustainability related, but to everything that we're trying to achieve with the so-called MDG Plus agenda and with the so-called new issues around governance, transparency and growth and cities and so forth. It also triggered a warning shot on the part of the G77 and a very clear line that, okay, we accept and we acknowledge and we understand and we believe that climate change is important, but we also don't want to make anything to do in these negotiations dependent on what happens in the UNFCCC. So despite the engagement, the intuitive engagement that I spoke about, there was a very, very clear political marker in the sand drawn very early on about the need to disentangle the two processes. So we had this sort of simultaneous sense of optimism and interest and engagement, but also politics in the room. The discussion then hinged on, I think, when I sort of wrote down in front of me, 3 things about climate change. The first was whether or not it should be a goal in the post-2015 development agenda. And if it were to be a goal, how to de-link it from the UNFCCC process. The second hinge point was, if it is to be integrated, what are the most obvious and powerful touch points across this agenda? And if it's established, how is it established in a way that has meaning and drives the rest of the agenda? And the third point, and I think this was a false distinction, but I'll say it anyway, and I know a number of people in the room will not like this point, but this was a point that was perceived in the room. If we are to include it as an integrated issue and or a goal, how do we do so in a way which doesn't detract focus from the job of finishing the MDGs? So those were sort of the three, in my interpretation and my listening to the open working group discussion, the three hinge points of the discussion that then followed. Should it be a goal? Should it not be a goal? If it's integrated, where is it integrated and how? How do we delink from the UNFCCC? How do we feature it in a way that retains space for what this agenda is, quote unquote, really supposed to be delivering? So that's where he ended up. Now, in the end, the conversation and the results that we have is a goal on climate change, largely pursued in the end by a handful of countries, but particularly powerfully pursued in the end by the French. I don't know if we have any. The French, but with an eye to the COP in Paris toward the end of next year, and visibility for 2 degrees in the framing chapeau, which was mainly pushed by the UK actually. So it's a positive step, but I think for the reasons, or perhaps the flaws, or the way in which the conversation was carried out following the initial introduction of climate change, it wasn't a complete conversation. It wasn't complete because there are still questions in everyone's mind about how best do we integrate climate change into the agenda in a way that really has meaning. So although we all acknowledge that it's the case, although we all acknowledge that it's important, it's all still to play for, really, in terms of how it actually happens. And I think that is a really critical point where we leave the open working group and we now embark on the rest of the agenda building up to the summit next year. So with that in mind, I think hopefully wind to your sail in the course of this conversation. What's necessary now? We've left the open working group process and we have 12 months, and frankly, who knows what's going to happen. What's clear is that there are a number of milestones over the autumn: the Secretary-General synthesis report, the European Union's Council conclusions, the discussion around means of implementation, the conversations building up to the Financing for Development conference next year. And these are processes which, who knows what's going to happen. Whether we end up with something which looks like what the Open Working Group has produced in its report in September next year, I think is still to play for. But what's clear is that we have an agenda that we need to work on over the next 12 months. I think first and foremostly we need to defend the ground that was made in the Open Working Group, at least in terms of the positive spirit in which the conversation entered on climate negotiations. And that's critical. I mean, it's certainly not a done deal, despite the positive feeling in the room, that we will end up with a goal or visibility for climate change. We really need to keep focusing on that. The second thing is, and I think this is why the conversation today is so very important, we need to get the answer right on integration. And we need to get it right from a number of angles, not only from the angle of what will drive climate-compatible outcomes in post-2015, but which also acknowledges and works with the interest groups that exist elsewhere in the agenda, whether it's cities and urbanisation, energy and access to natural resources, means of implementation, governance and transparency. It needs to be an agenda which works holistically. And so focusing on which targets, focusing on which indicators, focusing on which measurement tools, and focusing on which means of implementation. Those that do their homework on those questions, I think, will quickly find that their analysis is quickly and readily snapped up, particularly by those technical leads in New York who are really looking now to make sense of the Open Working Group proposals and distill that into the Secretary-General synthesis report. So I hope that that's been informative for you, for those that weren't involved in the Open Working Group process. And I also hope enthusing and inspiring for you as you think about integration in a practical and political way.
Mel, thank you very much indeed. I think that gives us insights into kind of what can happen next, and with an optimism about climate remaining visibly built through the process. I mean, what I didn't say is rather obvious to most of us in the room in terms of the timing for this meeting, that we have the Secretary-General's Climate Summit and the General Assembly coming up in just less than a fortnight now. So this is an opportunity to take this conversation into our own constituencies. In a way, there's a message from you there, Mel, around that, and I think that's a shared goal that we'll be working on to build on where the Open Working Groups got to. With that, I'd like to introduce Andrew Scott, who's a research fellow here at ODI and is working closely with the CDKN teams. Andrew, you've been deeply engaged and following the Open Working Group process, so you know this and have been working with many of the colleagues in the room and have been supporting the CDKN process as well as we've been having some conversations in different countries. So I'll leave you to introduce my colleagues and tell us a bit about that process. Thank you.